Sally, thank you so much for having me, and a warm thank you, everyone. I will admit this is a bit of an unusual experience for me, but I was able to catch part of Governor Jeb Bush's opening keynote as well. And one of the things that he talked about that really resonated with me was that you have to have a high quality education to succeed in this era of technology disruption. And I can share with you, having spent the last few years sitting in Silicon Valley, working with Intel, trying to change and disrupt technology. I think there are some things that are really critical, and I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about them today. But before I get started, because the theme is really we're all connected, I thought I'd start with a few facts about a famous West Virginia connector. Some of you may be familiar with the picture on the left. It's the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. You may or may not know that in 1849, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world when it was built, and it was the first long span wire cable suspension bridge in the country. Other facts about the bridge: it could actually hold 297 tons when it was built, which at the time was the equivalent of 32 heavily laden road wagons, 192 horses, and 500 people. The cables of the bridge actually rest on cast iron rollers that adapt for movement so that the bridge can actually change based on changes in temperature or transitory loads. So it's flexible. The bridge was destroyed by fire 5 years after it was built. I'm sorry, it was destroyed. I think it was actually destroyed by tornadoes. Now I have to go back and do my own fact checking. But it was rebuilt 6 years afterwards. Just a classic symbol of grit, which is something I think we'll talk about a little more today. And then there's another very little known fact about the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. Which is that in September of 1991, Mark Resteiner proposed to me next to the bridge. I said yes. And next month, we'll celebrate our 28th wedding anniversary. West Virginia, like Sally said, is a special place to me. I went to school at a school in Blacksburg, just south of West Virginia. And my husband went to school in Indiana. When we were dating in college, we would often get together. He would plan trips. I was a manufacturing engineer, so the way to my heart was planning tours of factories, the Weirton Steel Works, the Beckley Coal Mine. We went skiing at Snowshoe. So we spent a lot of time in the state of West Virginia, and it is very special to me. So I'm excited to be here today. As I was doing my research on the bridge, I did come across this quote, which I absolutely loved. And I'll just take a moment and read it. We've seen the stones laid upon one another, and like the workman who builds himself to the top of the highest tower, we scarcely appreciate the work we have done. But the stranger who sees it for the first time looks up with awe and wonder to those immense towers and gigantic cables. In many ways, I think that the concept of not stepping back and fully appreciating our work really still applies today. For example, how many of you kind of felt like this and this is what your career would be? I suspect not a lot of you are raising your hands. And yet, it's so often what our career paths look like. Others look up and they see a linear path. To the stranger who for the first time looks up, they see this immense tower and gigantic cables. And yet, this is kind of what it really looks like. It's, I think we don't step back and think about, what has it taken to build? What are the steps that we've taken to build to the tops of the towers? Do we appreciate the work we've done? And, have we thought about, how we've gone through those detours, the bridges that we've crossed? I mean, personally, my own journey looks a lot like this picture. And it's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today, but mainly I want to focus on some of the lessons that I learned along the way. And as Sally mentioned, I like to call my career journey from salsa to chips. I was a Texan for 20 some odd years, and salsa and chips is a famous appetizer. One could say, sticky on the bridge theme, a bridge between a meal and a bridge to a meal. And I worked for Pace Picante Sauce. I made SALSA. I made aluminum at one point in time, microwave radios. Started out as a manufacturing engineer, and I had a heck of a lot of titles in between. One of the, ones that my guidance counselor, Miss Orr, thank you, never discussed with me. But what struck me as I was thinking about my own career journey was that I've made some pretty big pivots along the way. And as I thought about them, most of those pivots started with somebody coming to me and saying, I've got some bad news. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about those pivots and then some of the things that I learned as a result. Probably the first pivot, the first major pivot that occurred was after being an engineer. I'd done some project management. I was leading some supply chain efforts. I found myself kind of miserable in my job. Our whole team was unhappy. And at the time, my boss, Steve, came and he said, he brought me into a conference room and he said, look, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The good news is they're disbanding our team. We don't have to do this anymore. And I was like, oh, thank goodness, we're all miserable. But the bad news is you still need to work here. And one of the things that he asked me to do was to support the marketing team managing their contracts. I looked at him and I said, Steve, I know nothing about marketing. He's like, you'll be fine. Came home, told my husband, hey, I'm going to do this for marketing, and I'm going to be in charge of like this massive budget, and and he's like, so you get to spend all this money? He's like, you'll be fine. But I dug in. I took the opportunity to learn. I asked a lot of questions, and I actually ended up working for the marketing team as a result. I found that many of my project management skills applied, and they actually helped me thrive. Another pivot happened when I didn't get a job I interviewed for. I was really happy at the company I was working for. I was working for a startup with really smart people. And a friend called and said, hey, I thought of you for this job. And I was like, okay, I always take a phone call, but, and he told me more. And I was like, okay, I see why you thought of me. And then asked, I said, do you know the hiring manager? He's like, yes, it's Bob. And I was like, I love Bob. I haven't talked to Bob in years. I'm happy to have a conversation with Bob. Interview with Bob for the job. And Bob comes back a couple weeks, I come back out of the interview and I'm like, if they offer me the job, I'll probably take it, but I don't think it's the right thing. I don't know what I'd be learning that's new. It just doesn't feel right, but gosh, I really love Bob. And then Bob calls a couple days later, Kathy, I've got some bad news. We actually selected somebody else for the role. And I was like, oh, thank you. I really appreciate knowing that, because I didn't feel like I was the best candidate based on what you needed. And, I have so much respect for you, Bob. I didn't want to turn you down, but I didn't think it was the right fit either. And he said, yeah, that's the thing. But, we've been thinking about, we really would love to have you on the team. And, we're hoping to find a role and we just don't know what that is yet. A couple months later, they called back and they asked me to lead their M&A integration programs. And I was like, I don't have a lot of experience there. And they're like, no, you'll be fine. You have done all of these different things in the business, and you'll know how to take those things and synthesize them. It's kind of like you're conducting an orchestra and you've played all the instruments. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. And it was a fabulous job. I did that for a company called McAfee in cybersecurity, which was then brought into Intel. And I did that for Intel for several years as well. And then, a little more recent pivot, and actually an ironic pivot, given what's going on today as I sit here working from home. But while I was doing the M&A integration role, my boss called, and we were going through a situation where I was living in Dallas, and I was working out of a building that was part of Intel. But it was the building was actually, and most of the business in the building was another division, and that division was being sold. And so I no longer had an office in Dallas. And at the time, the company had a policy that if you didn't have an office, working from home was discouraged and you needed to be at a core site. Again, really strange thinking about that in today's environment, but this was the situation then. So my boss called and said, hey, we've got, we have a bit of a problem we need to discuss. And we'd love to have you stay, but you need to either be in California or Oregon because you can't keep doing this from Dallas. So I had to kind of take a deep breath, and I thought very long and hard, and realized that I loved the job I was doing. I loved living where I lived, but if I went looking for another job, I was going to be, in one of maybe 5 companies, and I worked for one of the ones. And I'm like, I'm going to go looking for the job I have. Why don't we find a way to keep this job? And so I said, let's, maybe get an apartment. I'll commute back and forth between Dallas and Santa Clara in the Bay Area, and we'll see how it goes. Give it a year, try it out. Talked my husband into doing that. 3 months after I got to Santa Clara, the opportunity came up to be the chief of staff for the team. This was an amazing opportunity, one I never imagined. I got to work very closely with our executive team, working on our strategy, meeting all kinds of interesting people as we did venture investments in kind of startups that are doing really amazing things in technology, and just something that I never imagined, and nor necessarily would I have done it if I hadn't taken the risk and made the move. So I've spent the last 3 years in this role, and it really has allowed me to work on some amazing things. I share all of this because, along the way, I've learned a lot. I believe deeply there's usually an intersection of preparedness and opportunity. And I also recognize that success isn't always going to be linear. But I think that we can cultivate the skills to succeed, and really that ability to sway and to flex inside of the environment. And I'd like to talk about some of the skills, that I selected and that I thought about, that I've needed in my own career. And these are really, growth mindset. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. We'll talk a little bit more about what it is and kind of what it isn't. Resilience, grit, they're a bit different. And finally, responsibility. So I try to think about, how can we educate and how can we prepare, because we don't know what those jobs of tomorrow are going to look like. We don't know all of the things that are. It's not like you can go to a handbook and say, here's a great career pattern for you. But what we can do is we can educate for adaptation and change. So we'll start with growth mindset. And growth mindset is the understanding that abilities can be developed. A lot of research here is attributed to Carol Dweck. Her book Mindset is a classic if you haven't been able to read it. But Carol also in 2016 actually had to kind of go out. I think the idea of having a growth mindset became very popular, and Carol actually had to go out and dispel some myths about mindset. And one of the first myths she had was like, you can't just say you have a growth mindset about everything. You are going to have a fixed mindset and a growth mindset in different areas of your life. The reason that I have a picture of me attempting to play golf here is that I will confess that for pretty much my whole entire adult life, I have had a growth mindset about the sport of golf, that I just can't do it. And I found myself earlier this year living next to a golf course, realizing that it looked really pretty and there were a lot of people doing it, and perhaps, maybe just possibly, I could do it too. And I recognize that, the growth mindset here is I just haven't learned to get off the driving range yet. So I think about, the other misconceptions that Carol talked about, which is, just, reward praise, just praise the effort. And yes, praising the effort is important, but praising the learning process and recognizing that output and results matter too, that's just as important. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the idea of, growth mindset means, reward the effort. It means reward the effort and expect the outcomes. And it reminds me of, there's a Nelson Mandela quote that I love. I never lose. I either win or I learn. And I think that's so much of what having a growth mindset is. And then finally, the third myth that Carol dispelled about her work was that, just espouse a growth mindset and good things will happen. Yes, it's great to have a positive mindset, but there will be setbacks. There will be somebody who comes into the room and says, "Hey, I've got some bad news."
And that's really where a lot of opportunities come. And I think that connects into, I think, the next soft skill, which I believe is resilience. And resilience is the ability and tendency to bounce back. um, Resilient people kind of they have a pretty down to earth view, and kind of about the parts of reality that impact their survival. In really hard times, a resilient person will just stare down, accept what's going on, the adversity, and then they'll figure out what steps they need to take to get through them. It's the classic line of, you have survived 100% of your bad days. And I personally, I draw a lot of my own resilience from my support network. And I call them my personal board of directors. So just like a company has a board of directors, I feel like I have a group of people who hold me accountable. They will tell me what they think. I can ask them questions. I can seek candid feedback. They won't sugarcoat, and they hold me accountable. This mug reminds me of a group. I have a group of women in Dallas that we call ourselves the Diamonds. It's a small group of women who kind of support each other. We call ourselves the Diamonds because we're a little rough around the edges, but if you shine it, if you rub us, up enough, we'll sparkle and shine. So this mug reminds me of them. And back to the idea of a growth mindset. I recently had a small kind of setback, that I was dealing with, and I sent a note out to the group text, and I just said, hey, here's what's going on. And one of them came back to me instantly, and she said, well, here you grow again. And I thought that was such a great way of thinking about resilience. Another skill is grit. This is one I love. I was so excited to see the news a couple weeks ago about Sir Richard Branson's announcement about the Hyperloop Center in West Virginia. I've been kind of fascinated by Hyperloops for a couple of years now. I remember distinctly walking down the hall in my office, and one of our team members, Curtis, stopped me, and he's like, Kathy, I need to get you briefed on Hyperloops. And at that point, I thought, yeah, I really do kind of have a cool job. But I kept my composure, and I just looked at him and I said, great, that sounds good, Curtis. How about Thursday? Let's book an hour and let's talk about it. But I fundamentally think Hyperloop technology is really interesting, and I look forward to seeing it develop. And two, I think about somebody like Richard Branson, somebody like an Elon Musk, and the vision that they have, and that relentless pursuit of a long-term goal. And that is such an example of grit. And when we were talking about the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, I think grit is part of the state of West Virginia's heritage. And it's also something that many of you have probably seen. Angie Duckworth, she's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She was named a MacArthur Fellow, Genius Grant winner. TED Talk seen by millions. She looked at students and said, the students that succeeded in her classroom, I think she was teaching 7th grade math, the students that succeeded in her classroom weren't necessarily the ones that were the smartest, but they were the ones with the most grit. And the encouraging thing in Angie's work since then has been that really grit is something that can be taught. It's not luck. It's not how intensely in the moment you want something, but it's the sustainability, the drive, the passion, and the courage to pursue long-term goals. And it can be taught. And I think that's really exciting and something that we should all think about as we prepare students for their next career, for their careers. And finally, bringing it all back to bridges and rings with the theme of responsibility. Some of you may have seen this before. It's actually the ring here it's called an engineer's ring or an iron ring. It's worn by a lot of Canadian engineers, and I think some American engineering schools have developed the tradition. This is also something that having a personal board of directors is useful for. When you call them and say, or send them a text and say, hey, can you send me a picture of your engineer's ring? I'm working on this talk, and I need a picture, and no questions asked. I get the picture right back. But so this is actually a friend of mine. But the iron ring is it's a tradition. It was started in Canada in 1922, and a professor of engineering there wanted to honor and memorialize. There was a bridge collapse in Quebec in 1907 during construction, and 75 construction workers died in the collapse. When they were doing the root cause analysis, they found that there had been some calculations that were in error, and more importantly, they knew about the errors and they continued building the bridge anyway. And this engineering professor just felt that that was tragic and wanted to prevent something like that from happening again, and wanted to help the future engineers understand the responsibility they had for people's lives, for things, and the importance of their work. So the legend has it that the first rings that they developed a ceremony to really bridge training and experience. And the legend has it that the first rings that they gave to the engineering students were made from iron, with that was part of the bridge that collapsed. So I think about this, and the other thing that's interesting about the ring, it's if you look closely, you can see it's kind of nubbed and hard, and it's meant to be worn on the working hand. Now, I'm left-handed, so this doesn't work for me, but if you're right-handed and you're drafting back in 1922, the ring and the nubs on the ring might have hit against the paper, again, to be that symbolic reminder of the importance of your work. And I think, what I love about this is, one, the symbolism, and two, is instilling that sense of pride and responsibility, which is, again, another soft skill that I think is just so helpful for career readiness. So those are really the four things I wanted to talk about with you today. And as the challenge that I would make to this audience is, how are you helping connect the next generation to their future careers? Are you enabling that connection between preparedness and opportunity? Are you promoting that growth mindset? Are you promoting resilience, grit? Are you giving the students a sense of responsibility? And, maybe thinking about the symbols that you can use, and, people remember your stories, not your slides. And, maybe think about your own situation. 2020 has certainly been a year that's challenged all of us. Are you adopting? Is there somewhere new where you can adopt a growth mindset? Are you focused on your resiliency? Do you have a board of directors that you can trust to help you as you get through your toughest days? And finally, before I close, and I'll take a couple of Q&A if we have time, I think we will. But before I close, I always like to finish a lot of my talks with this. And this is a quote that comes from Robert Noyce. He's one of the founders of Intel. And it's, "Don't be encumbered by history, go off and do something wonderful." So if we prepare our students of today with nothing more than this, I think it's a huge thing that we can do to help them. Don't be encumbered by history, go off and do something wonderful. And with that, Sally, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. Your story highlights many of the skills, characteristics, and knowledge that the Education Alliance uses in their programs. We do have a couple of questions that came in on chat. So you mentioned how important your own personal board of directors was to you, and you suggest that it's something that students and others should look at. What's the best way that we can help students develop their own board of directors?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And, I think the other thing is, not only do I have my own personal board, I think I serve on several boards as well. I actually just had somebody that I was working with, and she actually she resigned. She took another job, and it's an amazing opportunity for her. And she came to me and she told me what she was doing, and she said, and I looked at her and I said, "Okay, this is fine. I'm really excited for you." I was like, "But I have one condition." I was like, "Will you still let me mentor you?" Because I find that I think that's really important. But I think the important thing for students to do is to ask. And ask and look for a diverse set of candidates to be on your board. It's not necessarily just your best friend. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's maybe it's somebody that you don't know very well, but you'd like to get to know better. And that's how you develop. And I think it's, it is really just asking good questions and, saying, hey, I'd like to understand your career path. I would like to understand, ask the best way is, ask somebody to talk about themselves. And I think that would develop the relationship. And I think bringing people into the classroom, introducing them to people, and I've seen this happen back, maybe when everything wasn't on Zoom, but the interaction and the casual interaction that can happen before and after those things can start lifelong friendships.